The restaurant was a place where only the richest people came. Its walls were painted in soft gold and cream, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The tables were covered in crisp white cloths, and the silverware gleamed under the light. It was the kind of place where people came not just to eat, but to see and be seen, where every movement seemed measured and every word carried weight. At the center of all this wealth and power worked a young waitress. She was quiet and careful, always making sure nothing spilled, nothing broke, and that every guest was served on time. Her uniform was neat, but it was simple, far from the designer outfits many of the women around her wore. Her hair was tied back in a simple bun, and she wore no jewelry except a small chain around her neck. Most people in the restaurant did not notice her. When she walked past, many eyes barely registered her presence. She would place a plate of food on the table, wait for a nod or a smile, and then move on to the next table without a word. She had learned early that in a place like this, it was better to be invisible than to draw attention, but invisibility came with a price. Many of the guests assumed that because she was quiet, she was inexperienced or clumsy. Some even laughed at small mistakes, like when she accidentally dropped a napkin or spilled a drop of water. "Watch where you're going," one man had whispered sharply one evening, just loud enough for others at the table to chuckle. She had bowed politely and apologized, feeling her cheeks burn, and moved on. On this particular night, the restaurant was especially busy. A famous pianist was supposed to play that evening, and a crowd of elite guests had gathered to enjoy both the music and the fine dining. The air buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But among all the excitement, the young waitress went about her work quietly, carrying plates and refilling glasses, her eyes always alert to the needs of the tables. Some guests, however, found it amusing to make fun of her. It started as whispers and small jokes. "Is she even trained to do this job?" one woman asked her friend, glancing at the waitress with a smirk. "She's so nervous, she might drop everything." The words were light, but they stung. The young waitress heard them but did not respond. She had learned long ago that arguing or explaining never worked. It only gave people more reason to laugh. As the night went on, the teasing grew louder. A small group of men at one table began pointing and whispering jokes about her uniform, her hands, and the way she moved around the room. "Maybe she should try playing the piano instead of serving," one of them said, laughing. His friends joined in, repeating the idea with exaggerated gestures. It was meant to be funny, but it was cruel. The young waitress felt a knot in her stomach. She kept her face calm and moved on to the next table, serving a couple who were engrossed in their conversation and had not even noticed the group mocking her. She had faced this kind of treatment before, but there was something about tonight that made it worse. The laughter felt louder, sharper, more mocking. The piano sat in the corner of the restaurant, polished and gleaming under the soft lights. It was a grand instrument, meant for performances that added elegance and charm to the evening. The pianist, who was famous for his talent, had been delayed, and the guests were growing restless. The group that had been mocking the waitress noticed this and found it an opportunity for more amusement. "Why don't we just make her play?" one of the men suggested with a grin. "Let's see if she can do anything besides carry plates." The others laughed loudly. The suggestion was not serious, but it carried the weight of their cruelty. They expected the restaurant manager to dismiss it immediately. The manager, a tall man with a kind face but a nervous temperament, hesitated. He had seen the young waitress work countless evenings with precision and care. He knew she had a talent for music, though few people ever saw it. She had studied piano as a child and had once dreamed of performing on stages far bigger than this restaurant. But life had taken her down a different path, and now she worked here quietly, almost invisible to the world. The guests did not know any of this, of course. They only saw someone small and quiet, someone who seemed powerless. The manager cleared his throat nervously. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said softly. But the men laughed louder, joking that she was scared, that she would never be able to play in front of a crowd like this. Their voices carried through the restaurant, drawing the attention of other guests. The young waitress stopped in her tracks when she heard the suggestion. Her heart raced. She had never performed in front of a crowd like this, not since she was a child. The memory of a grand stage, bright lights, and an audience filled with strangers both excited and terrified her. She shook her head, trying to stay calm. I can't, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the laughter. But the men ignored her protest, seeing it as part of the fun. Come on, just for a few minutes, one of them said, clapping his hands. We'll be your audience. The manager looked at her, guilt written across his face. He knew she could play, but he also knew the risk of putting her on display against her will. Yet the guests were insistent, and their mocking laughter made him uneasy. Finally, he approached her gently. Just for a few minutes, he said softly. If you don't want to, you can stop any time, please. The young waitress hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked toward the piano. She could feel the eyes of the elite crowd on her, watching every step. Every laugh, every whisper, every smirk made her want to turn away, but something inside her stirred. She had spent years keeping this part of herself hidden, and tonight, though unwilling she was being called forward, she sat down on the piano bench, her fingers hovering above the keys. The room seemed to grow quiet, except for the faint hum of conversation and the distant clinking of silverware. Her chest tightened as she took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the hours she had spent practicing piano, the melodies that had flowed from her fingertips when no one was watching. The first note she pressed was soft, almost hesitant. She expected the laughter to continue, but something unexpected happened. The sound was clear and pure, resonating through the restaurant in a way that made people pause. The mocking whispers faded into silence. Guests turned their heads, some leaning forward, curious. The young waitress's fingers moved with more confidence, more certainty. The melody began to flow, gentle at first, then stronger, carrying emotion and depth. She did not look at the crowd. She focused on the piano, letting her hands remember what she had almost forgotten. Each note told a story of longing, of struggle, of hidden talent and hidden pain. The elite guests who had mocked her before now sat frozen, unable to believe the music they were hearing. Some held their breath, some exchanged stunned glances. The room had transformed from a place of laughter to a space filled with awe and respect. The young waitress felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in years, she was seen not as a waitress, not as someone to be laughed at, but as a musician, as someone with talent and heart. She played on, her confidence growing with each note, and she realized that the audience's opinion no longer mattered. This was her moment, and she would not let it pass. By the time she finished, the restaurant was silent for a few seconds before a wave of applause erupted. Some guests were on their feet, clapping and cheering. The men who had mocked her earlier looked stunned, unable to speak. The young waitress sat back, her hands resting on the keys, feeling a rush of relief and pride. She had faced humiliation, fear, and doubt, and had transformed it into something beautiful that night. She walked back to her duties not just as a waitress, but as someone who had finally been noticed for her true self. And though the piano would remain in the corner of the restaurant, its music now carried a story that no one would ever forget, the story of the quiet, overlooked girl who could stop a room with a single melody. The restaurant was buzzing, but a tense energy had started to settle in the room. The group of elite guests, who had spent most of the evening mocking the young waitress, were now more curious than amused. They hadn't expected her to even touch the piano, let alone play a melody that carried so much depth and emotion. Her performance earlier had left them in stunned silence, and they were still trying to process what had just happened. The young waitress had returned to her duties, carrying plates and refilling drinks as if nothing had changed. But inside, she felt a whirlwind of emotions, relief, pride, and an undercurrent of anxiety. She knew the night was far from over. The famous pianist who was supposed to perform that evening had not yet arrived. Guests kept glancing toward the empty piano, murmuring among themselves. The anticipation was thick, and the elite group who had laughed at her earlier was restless, still unsure of how to act after witnessing her unexpected talent. The whispers began again, this time softer, almost hesitant. "Did you see her hands?" She played like a professional, one man said, his voice low, as if admitting it aloud made it more real. Another shook his head, trying to hide a smile, though he couldn't hide the hint of admiration in his eyes. The mocking tone was gone. Replaced by curiosity and a growing respect, the young waitress moved through the tables carefully, making sure everyone had what they needed. She noticed the glances that followed her, some filled with disbelief, others with genuine interest. For a moment, she felt exposed, as if the crowd could see through her, past the uniform and the quiet exterior, into the life she had left behind. She quickly focused on her work, knowing she had to stay grounded until the evening was over. Meanwhile, the group of men who had been the loudest in mocking her earlier had not given up. Their curiosity had shifted into something bolder. One of them leaned toward the manager, his voice almost teasing, but with a hint of challenge. "She plays well, no doubt about it," he said. "But can she really handle a real performance?" The piano in the corner. "That's no small thing. Maybe we should see what she can do with a full piece." The manager's heart sank. He knew exactly what they were suggesting. They wanted to put her on the stage in front of everyone, to see her perform for the entire crowd before the professional pianist arrived. He hesitated, torn between protecting her and avoiding confrontation with the guests. "I don't think that's necessary," he said quietly. "The pianist will be here soon. We don't want to—" But the man cut him off, laughing lightly, a sound meant to charm but edged with arrogance. "Oh, come on. Just one song. We already know she can play. Let's see what she can really do. It might be interesting." His friends laughed softly, and their eyes shone with a mix of expectation and disbelief. The young waitress overheard the conversation. Her stomach tightened. She had hoped the night would settle down after her brief performance earlier. She hadn't planned on playing again, not in front of this crowd, not under their scrutiny. Her hands shook slightly as she carried a tray of glasses to a nearby table, but she tried to steady her breathing. A few minutes later, the group's laughter and nudging caught the attention of the entire restaurant. Guests who had been focused on their meals and conversations now turned to see what was happening. The manager approached her quietly, speaking in a low voice so that no one else could hear. "They want you to play again," he said, concern in his eyes. "Only if you feel comfortable. You can stop any time." She shook her head slightly, almost instinctively, but her mind raced. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, waiting, expecting something extraordinary. She knew they didn't understand what it meant to stand there and perform, to let the music carry your story to strangers. She remembered the lessons she had learned as a child, the hours spent practicing alone, the feeling of the piano beneath her fingers, and the emotion that poured from her soul when she played. Her gaze drifted to the grand piano in the corner. Its polished surface gleamed under the lights, reflecting the curious faces of the guests. She hesitated, thinking of what could happen if she refused. The mocking laughter might start again, louder this time, and she would have to face the embarrassment in front of everyone. But if she played, maybe she could transform the moment again like she had before. With a quiet sigh, she walked toward the piano, her steps measured but steady. Guests turned to watch, some whispering to one another, others holding their breath in anticipation. The group that had been teasing her earlier leaned forward, eager to see if the young waitress could rise to the challenge. They didn't know it yet, but this would be a performance they would never forget. She sat on the bench and placed her hands lightly on the keys. The silence in the restaurant was almost overwhelming. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting her memories and emotions guide her fingers. The first note was soft, deliberate, almost hesitant. But this time she was determined to show them more, not just a simple melody, but the depth of her talent, the story she carried within her. As she played, the mood in the restaurant began to shift. Guests who had been chatting and laughing became silent, drawn into the music. The elite group who had mocked her earlier could no longer hide their surprise. Their eyes widened and some leaned closer, as if trying to see the source of the magic. The melody was richer, more complex than before, filled with emotion that spoke to something deep within the listeners. Her hands moved with confidence now, each note deliberate and full of expression. The room seemed to transform, the hum of conversation replaced by the resonance of the piano. Guests held their breath, captivated by the unexpected depth of her music. The young waitress played on, her heart racing but her focus unwavering. She had been invisible for so long, and now she was seen not just for her work, but for the talent and passion she had kept hidden for years. The professional pianist had still not arrived, and it didn't matter. The room was entirely hers. Every eye was on her, every ear attuned to the melody flowing from her fingers. She could feel the change in the atmosphere, the disbelief, the admiration, the respect growing with every note. Even those who had laughed at her earlier were now silent, unsure of how to respond. The mocking had vanished, replaced by awe as the music reached its peak. A sense of calm and control washed over her. She realized she was no longer performing for them. She was performing for herself, for the years she had spent practicing in secret, for the dreams she had nearly given up. The restaurant, once a place of judgment and laughter, had become a stage for her to reclaim a part of herself that had been hidden for too long. Finally, she brought the piece to a close. The last note lingered in the air, resonating through the hall like a gentle echo. For a few seconds there was silence, as if the room itself were catching its breath. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began. It started with a few guests, but soon the entire restaurant joined in. Some guests were on their feet, clapping, their expressions filled with surprise and admiration. The young waitress sat back, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her chest heaving with exertion and relief. She looked out at the crowd and saw faces transformed, some shocked, some moved, all changed in some way by the music she had shared. The group who had mocked her earlier was quiet, stunned into silence. They could no longer see her as invisible or unworthy. They had witnessed something remarkable, something beyond their expectations. The manager approached her again, a smile of relief on his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "But, thank you. You were incredible." She nodded, a small smile breaking through, feeling a sense of pride she hadn't felt in years. The music had spoken for her, and it had been heard. As she returned to her duties once more, the whispers had changed. Guests now talked in admiration, sharing their surprise at the young waitress who had captivated them all. Even the elite group who had once mocked her now seemed hesitant to speak, their previous arrogance replaced by a newfound respect. The night continued, but the energy in the room had shifted irreversibly. The invisible girl was no longer invisible. She had revealed a part of herself that demanded recognition, and the memory of her music would linger in that restaurant long after the evening ended. She carried plates and refilled glasses. But now, with every step, there was a subtle confidence in her movements. She knew that people had begun to see her differently, not just as a waitress, but as someone with depth, skill, and courage. The piano in the corner remained, waiting, silent yet ready, a reminder that her story was far from over. The room was quiet now, but the silence was heavy with expectation. The young waitress had returned to her duties after her brief performance, yet the air seemed different. Guests whispered among themselves, stealing glances at the piano in the corner, as if wondering if she would play again. The group that had once mocked her lingered near the tables, uncertain how to act. Their laughter had vanished, replaced by a mixture of curiosity, awe, and something that resembled regret. For the young waitress, the moment was electric and terrifying. She had felt the rush of performing earlier, the way her fingers moved across the keys with confidence and emotion. But now, standing in the middle of the restaurant, carrying trays and serving dishes, she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She had shown them a small taste before, but the full truth of her talent had yet to be revealed. The famous pianist who was supposed to perform that night had still not arrived. Guests were growing restless, and the group that had teased her earlier saw another opportunity. They approached the manager, their voices lighter than before, but with an unmistakable challenge. "Why don't we let her play again? One full piece this time. Let's see if she really has what it takes." Their eyes sparkled with curiosity and a hint of mischief, as if daring the manager to refuse. The manager hesitated. He had seen the way she had played earlier, the beauty and depth in her music, and he knew she could handle it. But he also knew the pressure this crowd could create. Still, he recognized that something extraordinary had just unfolded, something that deserved more than a small performance. He approached the young waitress quietly, speaking in a low voice. "They want you to play again," he said gently. "Only if you want to. You can stop any time. Please don't feel forced." She stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, watching, waiting. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray she had been carrying. She looked at the grand piano in the corner, its polished surface gleaming under the lights. It called to her, quiet and strong, reminding her of all the years she had spent practicing alone. Dreaming of moments like this and fearing them at the same time, her mind raced. Could she do it? Could she take the risk of playing again in front of people who had once laughed at her? Could she let the music flow freely, without hesitation, without fear? She swallowed hard and took a step toward the piano. Feeling the eyes of the entire restaurant on her as she sat down on the bench, the room seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with anticipation, the hum of conversation replaced by the silent waiting of guests who sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling at first, then steadying as she remembered the lessons and countless hours of practice that had brought her here. The first note she played was soft, almost fragile. It cut through the silence of the restaurant like a drop of water in a still pond, drawing the attention of every guest. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her, letting her fingers move instinctively. The melody was gentle at first, but as she played, it began to swell. Rich with emotion, full of life and tinged with a pain only she truly understood, the elite crowd, who had once mocked her, were frozen in their seats. Their expressions shifted from disbelief to astonishment. Some leaned forward, unable to look away, captivated by the depth of feeling pouring from the piano. Others exchanged glances, unsure how to react, their previous arrogance replaced by a growing respect and wonder. Her hands moved with increasing confidence, the music growing more complex and powerful. Every note carried a story of hidden talent, lost opportunities, and dreams nearly abandoned. The melody spoke to something deep inside the listeners, touching hearts that had once been closed off to her. Even the group who had laughed at her earlier could no longer hide their amazement. Their eyes widened and some whispered to each other, unable to believe what they were witnessing. The young waitress felt something shift inside her as she played. The fear and anxiety that had gripped her earlier melted away, replaced by a sense of control and purpose. She was no longer performing to appease anyone. She was expressing herself, letting the music tell her story in a way words never could. Every note, every chord, every pause was an extension of her emotions, her life, her journey. As the piece built to its climax, the restaurant was transformed. The sound of silverware and glasses, the hum of conversation, even the shifting of chairs faded into nothingness. All that remained was the music and the story it carried. Guests were silent, captivated, some holding their breath as they experienced something they had never expected from a simple waitress in a quiet uniform for the first time. The young waitress allowed herself to feel the weight of her own talent. She remembered the long nights of practice, the sacrifices she had made, the dreams she had almost let go of. And now, in this moment, she was reclaiming them. Her fingers danced across the keys with a grace and precision that left the audience in awe. Each note was deliberate, each chord filled with emotion. The music seemed to float through the room, wrapping around everyone like a gentle embrace. Some guests were visibly moved, their eyes glistening with emotion. A few wiped their eyes discreetly, unable to contain the impact of the melody. Even the men who had mocked her earlier were silent, their previous smirks replaced by expressions of astonishment and regret. They had expected a simple performance, perhaps even a laughable attempt. But what they had witnessed was far beyond anything they could have imagined. The young waitress continued to play. Lost in the music, unaware of the shifting energy in the room, she felt as if the piano was an extension of herself, a bridge between her hidden life and the world around her. The melody grew stronger, more passionate, carrying the full weight of her emotions. It was a declaration, a revelation. And a statement all at once. She was not invisible, she was not ordinary. And her talent could not be denied. As the final notes rang out, the restaurant fell into a profound silence. The echoes of the piano lingered in the air, leaving everyone in a state of stunned reverence. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The weight of what had just happened pressed gently on every soul in the room. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began to ripple through the restaurant. It started as a soft clapping from a few guests, then grew louder until the entire room was on its feet, cheering, clapping, and shouting in admiration. Some guests laughed in disbelief. Others cried softly, and many simply stared. Overwhelmed by the unexpected brilliance of the young waitress, the group who had mocked her earlier looked around, their faces pale and eyes wide. They could hardly comprehend that the girl they had laughed at was capable of such beauty and skill. The manager approached, his expression a mix of pride and relief. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. "But, thank you. You were incredible." The young waitress nodded, a small, almost shy smile crossing her face. She felt the rush of emotions, pride, relief, joy, and a deep sense of accomplishment. For years she had hidden her talent, living quietly, invisible to the world. And now she had shown everyone that she was not just a waitress. She was an artist, a musician, and someone who could captivate a room with nothing but her hands and a piano. As she returned to her duties, the energy in the restaurant had shifted completely. Guests no longer whispered mockingly. Instead, they talked in admiration, sharing stories of the music they had just heard. Some approached her with gentle compliments, others simply watched her in awe. The elite crowd who had once laughed at her now seemed hesitant, unsure how to express their respect without betraying their previous arrogance. The young waitress carried plates and refilled glasses, her movements now calm, confident, and purposeful. She felt a sense of validation, not from the applause or recognition, but from the knowledge that she had shared a part of herself that was real, raw, and powerful. The piano in the corner remained, silent yet commanding, a reminder that her story was far from over. Tonight had changed everything. She had transformed from someone overlooked and underestimated to a person who could command attention, inspire emotion, and earn respect through her talent. And as the music settled into memory, she knew that this was only the beginning of her journey, one where she would no longer hide, no longer be invisible, and no longer let fear dictate her life. The young waitress had played, and in doing so she had frozen the elite crowd in a moment of awe. She had proven that true talent could not be ignored, that courage and skill could triumph over mockery, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room could leave the deepest impression. The applause had faded, but the energy in the restaurant had completely shifted. The elite crowd who had once mocked the young waitress now sat in stunned silence, still trying to process what they had witnessed. There was something almost magical about the way she had played something that had touched them more deeply than they could understand. The room was full of people, yet it felt as if she had created a bubble around herself, a space where only the music and her story existed. The young waitress moved quietly among the tables, carrying plates and refilling glasses, her face calm but her heart still racing. She could feel the weight of curious eyes following her every move. People whispered among themselves, some openly, others in hushed tones. "Did you see her hands?" One guest murmured. She played with such emotion, as if the piano was part of her soul. Another shook his head, unable to speak for a moment, still in disbelief at the talent they had almost overlooked. As she returned to the corner of the restaurant, her gaze drifted to the piano. The instrument had always been a part of her life, a friend she could rely on when the world felt too heavy. She had started learning when she was very young, spending hours practicing, her small fingers moving quickly and carefully across the keys. Music had been her escape, her way of expressing feelings she could not put into words. But life had not been kind to her dreams. Family troubles, financial struggles, and unexpected tragedies had forced her to leave behind the stage and the applause she had once imagined. She had taken this job at the restaurant because she had to survive, Not because she had wanted to give up her music entirely. Now, standing before this crowd of strangers, she realized something powerful. Her past, her pain, her hidden talent had all led her to this moment. Every note she had played told a story, not just of skill, but of perseverance. Of a young girl who refused to let her dreams die completely. Even when the world had tried to force her into invisibility, the elite guests were beginning to lean forward in their chairs, some with awe, some with curiosity. The group who had laughed at her earlier could hardly meet her eyes. Their previous arrogance had vanished, replaced by a quiet realization that they had judged her too quickly, too harshly. Some of them whispered apologies to one another, though they did not speak them to her directly. They were learning a lesson they had not expected that. Talent and courage could appear in the most unlikely of places. The manager approached her cautiously, aware that her talent had left a deep impression on everyone in the room. "You didn't have to play again," he said quietly, his voice full of admiration. "But you showed them something extraordinary. They'll never see you the same way again." She nodded, a small, almost shy smile forming on her lips. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time in years, she felt recognized not just as a worker, but as someone with value, skill, and heart. The famous pianist who had been delayed finally arrived. His presence immediately noticed by the guests. He was known for his talent, for performances that drew crowds and accolades. Yet, as he entered the room, he noticed the young waitress sitting quietly near the piano. Her uniform simple, her demeanor calm, but her eyes bright and focused. He paused, sensing something remarkable about the situation. The pianist approached cautiously, his curiosity piqued. "Did you play just now?" he asked softly, almost not daring to hope for an answer. She nodded quietly. "Yes," she said simply. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of her experiences. Of the years she had spent hiding her talent, he studied her hands, her posture, the way she carried herself, and something in him recognized the skill immediately. He could see the depth of her training, the emotion in her playing, and the restraint she had shown by not performing more boldly earlier. "Incredible," he whispered, almost to himself. "Truly incredible." The crowd began to gather around, some whispering to one another, others quietly observing the exchange. The young waitress felt a strange mix of emotions, nervousness, pride, and a sense of destiny. This was the moment when her past and her present collided. The music she had kept hidden, the talent she had nurtured in private, was now being recognized openly by someone who truly understood its value. She thought back to the years she had spent practicing in solitude, the countless nights when she had poured her emotions into the piano, the sacrifices she had made and the dreams she had almost given up. And now, here she was, in a restaurant full of strangers, and yet she felt an unexpected sense of belonging. She had proven to herself that her talent was real, that her music mattered, and that she could touch hearts even in the most unlikely circumstances. The pianist offered her a gentle smile. "Would you play with me?" he asked, his voice respectful and warm. The request was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. This was an invitation to step fully into her talent, to embrace what she had always known was a part of her, and to show the world the full depth of her abilities. The young waitress hesitated for a moment, feeling the eyes of the elite crowd, the weight of their admiration, and the memory of those who had mocked her earlier. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady now. She sat at the piano, feeling the polished keys beneath her fingers, and allowed the pianist to join her dot as they began to play together. The restaurant transformed once again. The music was richer, fuller, more powerful than anything that had come before. The melody carried layers of emotion, blending her experience with his expertise. Guests were entranced, some leaning forward, others closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Even the group that had mocked her earlier watched in awe, unable to hide their astonishment. The young waitress felt a sense of liberation as she played. Every note was a declaration of her journey, her struggles, and her triumphs. She no longer felt invisible. She no longer felt overlooked. She was fully present, fully seen, and fully heard. The music spoke where words could not, telling a story of resilience, talent, and the quiet power of persistence. By the end of the piece, the restaurant was silent once more, save for the lingering resonance of the final chord. The audience sat in awe, hearts racing, minds still absorbing the brilliance they had just witnessed. The applause began slowly, almost hesitant at first, then grew into a wave of admiration and respect. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and some wiping tears from their eyes. The manager approached, his eyes shining with pride. "You have changed everything tonight," he said softly. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who has seen you play. They will never forget this evening?" The young waitress nodded, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. She had reclaimed a part of herself that had been hidden for too long, and in doing so she had transformed the way others saw her. The elite crowd, once full of arrogance and judgment, now approached her with newfound respect. Some asked questions about her training, some complimented her talent, and others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The memory of their mockery was replaced by admiration and humility. They had witnessed a quiet girl rise to a moment of brilliance, and it had left an indelible mark on all of them. The young waitress returned to her duties, her movements calm and confident. She felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. Her talent, once hidden, had been recognized. Her music had touched hearts. And the piano, silent now, remained as a reminder of the power of courage, perseverance, and self-belief. That night she realized that her journey was far from over. The music she had once thought lost to circumstance had found its way back into her life. The recognition she had received was not just about fame or praise. It was about reclaiming her identity, embracing her talent, and showing the world the strength that had always existed within her. For the guests, the evening had been unforgettable. They had come expecting a simple dinner, perhaps a performance by a famous pianist. Instead, they had witnessed something extraordinary: a young waitress, overlooked and underestimated, who played with such emotion and skill that it left the entire room in awe. They had learned an important lesson that night. Talent and courage can appear in the most unlikely places, and true brilliance cannot be hidden forever. And for the young waitress, the memory of that night would stay with her forever. It was the night she stepped out of the shadows, embraced her past, and showed the world her true self. The piano, once a quiet companion in her private life, had become the bridge between who she was and who she was meant to be. And as she continued her work in the restaurant, she knew that her music, her story, and her courage would never again be invisible. The applause had barely died down when the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted completely. The young waitress, once overlooked and mocked, now carried herself with quiet confidence. Guests whispered among themselves, exchanging glances filled with amazement and admiration. Even the group that had teased her earlier now seemed unsure of how to act. Their arrogance had melted away, replaced by a deep respect for the girl who had captivated the entire room with her music. The young waitress moved carefully between tables, carrying plates and refilling glasses, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept glancing at the grand piano in the corner, polished and gleaming under the warm lights. It had been her companion through so many lonely nights, her place of refuge when the world felt too heavy. Tonight it had become the stage for her triumph, a bridge between her hidden talent and the recognition she had long deserved. The famous pianist, who had arrived earlier, now stood nearby, watching her with a mixture of awe and respect. He had seen countless musicians in his life, many of them highly trained and world-renowned, but something about her performance had struck him deeply. There was a rawness, a sincerity, and an emotional depth in her playing that could not be taught. It was a combination of skill, passion, and a story that only she could tell through her music. "Would you consider performing professionally?" he asked gently, his voice calm yet filled with genuine interest. "I've never seen anyone play with such emotion and precision, especially under pressure like that." The young waitress paused, her hands trembling slightly. The thought of stepping into a world she had once dreamed of, a world of stages and audiences, felt both thrilling and terrifying. She thought back to the years she had spent practicing alone, The hours she had poured into perfecting every note, the sacrifices she had made to keep her dream alive despite life's hardships. For so long, she had believed her talent would remain hidden, a quiet part of her life that no one would ever notice. And now, here was someone recognizing it, offering her a path she had only dared to imagine in private. I don't know, she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the soft murmurs of the restaurant. I've spent so long hiding, so long avoiding attention. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. But even as she spoke, a spark of hope flickered within her. The music she had shared tonight had opened a door she could no longer ignore. The pianist smiled gently. You've already touched many people tonight, he said. Your music has power. Don't let fear hold you back. You can inspire, you can change lives, and sometimes the world needs to see who you really are. Meanwhile, the guests who had once mocked her had begun to approach her cautiously. Their expressions were a mix of humility and curiosity, as if they were unsure how to speak to someone they had underestimated so completely. One of them, the man who had first suggested she play, stepped forward, his voice soft and hesitant. I'm sorry, he said. We were wrong to judge you. What you played, it was incredible. You're amazing. The young waitress nodded, accepting their apology with quiet grace. She could feel the weight of their words, not because she needed validation, but because it confirmed what she had always known in her heart. Talent and courage could not be hidden forever. Her music had spoken for her, telling the story of her life in a way words never could. More guests approached, some offering compliments, others simply shaking their heads in disbelief. She smiled politely, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For years she had worked quietly, often overlooked, carrying the weight of her dreams in secret. And now those dreams were being acknowledged, not just by strangers, but by people who had once laughed at her. The manager watched from a distance, a proud smile on his face. He had always known she was talented, had always believed in her, but seeing the transformation in the room filled him with awe. The atmosphere was no longer one of casual dining or polite conversation, it was a place of reverence. A room that had been touched by something extraordinary. The young waitress returned to the piano, encouraged by the respect and recognition she was receiving. She placed her hands on the keys and played a few soft notes, letting the music flow gently through the room once more. The guests leaned in, captivated again by the depth of her talent, the sincerity of her performance. It was not a performance for applause this time. It was a quiet reminder that she had always been more than they had ever imagined. As the night went on, opportunities began to present themselves. The famous pianist spoke with the manager, discussing ways to introduce her to a wider audience, to give her the stage she had always deserved. Invitations to perform in other venues, requests for lessons and collaborations, and offers from music enthusiasts began to take shape. For the first time, the young waitress realized that her life could change in ways she had only dreamed of. She thought about her past, the struggles that had led her to this point. She remembered the quiet nights of practice, the sacrifices, and the moments of doubt when she had wondered if her talent would ever be seen. And now, standing in a restaurant filled with people who had once underestimated her, she felt a sense of triumph that went beyond applause. She had proven first to herself and now to the world that her abilities were real, powerful, and worthy of recognition. The group who had mocked her earlier lingered, hesitant to leave. They had learned a valuable lesson that night one about judgment, humility, and the unexpected depth that could lie within a person who appeared quiet or unassuming. Their laughter and arrogance had been replaced by respect and a newfound understanding that brilliance could appear in the most unlikely places. As the evening drew to a close, the restaurant returned to its usual calm, but the memory of her music lingered in every corner. Guests left with stories to tell, whispers of awe and admiration, and the knowledge that they had witnessed something rare and extraordinary. The young waitress, once invisible, had become the center of attention, not through force or ambition, but through the natural brilliance of her talent, and the courage to share it. The manager approached her one final time that night. "You've changed the course of your life," he said softly. And you've changed the way everyone in this room will remember you. Don't forget that. This is only the beginning." She nodded, a tear of quiet happiness forming in her eye. She had always known her talent was real, but now she had proof that it could change her life and perhaps even the lives of others. The piano, now silent, remained in the corner as a symbol of possibility. It had been her companion in solitude, her outlet for expression, and now it had become the instrument of transformation. She knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, full of new experiences and responsibilities, but she also knew that she had the strength, the skill, and the heart to embrace it fully. That night, as she left the restaurant, she walked with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer the quiet, overlooked waitress. She was an artist, a musician, and a woman who had faced fear, judgment, and doubt and had risen above them all. Her music had frozen the elite crowd in awe, but more importantly, it had awakened her own understanding of her worth and her potential. The story of the young waitress would be remembered, not just for the music she played, but for the courage she had shown, the talent she had revealed, and the way she had transformed a room filled with doubt into a space of admiration and respect. She had proven that sometimes the quietest person in the room can have the loudest impact, that perseverance and hidden talent can never truly remain hidden, and that the world will eventually notice those who are brave enough to show their true selves. Her life had changed in a single evening, but the transformation had begun long before, in the quiet hours of practice, in moments of doubt and determination, and in the refusal to let the world define her worth. The applause, the recognition, and the admiration were all powerful, but they were merely reflections of the talent, courage, and heart that she had carried with her all along. And as she walked away that night, leaving the grand piano behind, she carried with her a new sense of hope, possibility, and confidence. The young waitress had become so much more than anyone in that restaurant had ever imagined. She had become a symbol of resilience, talent, and the quiet power that exists within those who dare to believe in themselves. The night had ended, but the story of her courage and brilliance would continue. Guests would speak of her for years, sharing the tale of the girl who had frozen an elite crowd with her music, who had turned mockery into admiration, and who had shown the world that true talent cannot remain hidden forever. And for the young waitress herself, the evening was the beginning of a journey she had always dreamed of, a journey filled with music, recognition, and the fulfillment of a life she had always imagined but never dared to claim until now. She had played, she had been seen, and she had changed everything,